Nearly 4,000 years ago, in the shadow of a mountain outside modern Naples, something extraordinary happened to the ground itself. Thousands of footprints, human and animal, adult and child, some bare, some wrapped in something like sandals, were pressed into wet volcanic ash, and then sealed there, perfectly preserved, for the next several millennia. Every footprint points the same direction. Away, for most of human history, a destroyed camp wasn't a disaster story. It was a Tuesday. Fire, flood, eruption, raid, something eventually came for every fire ring a group of early humans ever built. What separated the communities that vanished from the ones that didn't wasn't luck. It was what happened in the hours and the generations immediately after. The oldest clear case sits at the bottom of a lake. On the southwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, in Israel, archaeologist Danny Nadel of the University of Haifa spent over a decade excavating a campsite called Ohalo II, dated to roughly 23,000 years ago. One of the oldest hunter-gatherer camps ever found, with its buildings still identifiable. 6 oval huts, built from tamarisk and oak branches, stood along the shoreline. Grass bedding was still preserved on the floor of one of them. Fishing nets, wild cereal grains, brush walls, an entire domestic world frozen in place. Then it burned. All 6 huts show clear burn damage, and Nadel's team found signs pointing toward a deliberate fire rather than an accident, the kind of controlled burn a group might set on purpose before moving on, whether for pest control, ritual closure, or simply because starting fresh was easier than patching old walls. Either way, the camp didn't survive it. What survived was the ash layer underneath, sealed by a rising lake only years later and left undisturbed for more than 20,000 years, until drought and heavy water pumping dropped the Sea of Galilee low enough in 1989 for archaeologists to find it. So the very first data point complicates the question immediately. Sometimes destroyed wasn't something that happened to a camp. It was something the camp's own people did to it, on their way out the door. 11,000 years ago, in what's now the Vale of Pickering in North Yorkshire, England, a very different kind of evidence turned up at a site called Carr, the oldest known house ever found in Britain. Archaeologist Milner of the University of York led 15 years of excavation there, and one of the clearest findings to come out of it was almost mundane. The house had been rebuilt. Not once, at least 5 separate times, on the same footprint across generations. There's no single fire or flood blamed for each collapse. The site sat at the marshy edge of a lake, and structures there likely settled and rotted as a matter of course. But the pattern is the point. Whatever wore the house down, the response was never to abandon the site and start over somewhere new. It was to rebuild, in the exact same spot, 5 times over. A modern renter dealing with that many structural disputes would have filed a complaint and moved out. The people at Carr just kept building the same house back. Fire, decay, drought, rising water. So far, every villain in this story has been the natural world doing what the natural world does. But one site breaks that pattern entirely, and it's the one that turns this from a survival story into something darker. 10,000 years ago, on the shore of a lagoon at the edge of Kenya's Lake Turkana, a group of hunter-gatherers lost their camp to something other than weather. In 2012, a team led by archaeologist Mirazón Lahr of the University of Cambridge uncovered the remains of 27 individuals at a site now called Nadel. Men, women, at least 6 children, 1 woman who appears to have been pregnant. So what actually happened to them? 10 of the 12 most complete skeletons showed unmistakable signs of violent death. Skulls fractured by blunt weapons, obsidian projectile points still lodged in bone, at least 2 individuals found with their hands apparently bound. None of the bodies had been buried. They'd simply been left where they fell, at the water's edge. And the lagoon's mud did for Nadel what the Sea of Galilee did for Ohalo II, sealed the scene for 10,000 years. Lahr's team, publishing in Nature in 2016, argued this was the earliest solid evidence of organized violence between hunter-gatherer groups, essentially a raid. Not everyone agrees. A team at Arizona State University later published a challenge, questioning whether every injury dated to the same event or whether some damage happened long after death. That debate still isn't fully settled, but the core fact isn't in dispute. Unlike every other camp in this story, this one was never reclaimed by its own people. Nobody came back to bury the dead. Whatever community lived at that lagoon simply ends, in the record on that shoreline. which makes the last piece of evidence matter even more. Back at the footprints outside Naples, the ones sealed in ash almost 4,000 years ago, the eruption came from an earlier explosion of Vesuvius. A 2006 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences ranked as larger than the blast that would famously bury Pompeii 2,000 years later. French archaeologist Claude Albor-Lividi, who directed the excavation of the buried settlement at Nolla Croce del Papa, found almost none of the community's belongings left behind inside its huts, a detail that told him something specific. These people had time to grab what mattered and run. Only 3 structures in the entire village were left standing. The surrounding land was likely unlivable for generations afterward, and yet people came back. Later excavations nearby turned up a new settlement built centuries after the eruption on land that had once been buried under the same volcano's ash, a settlement whose builders almost certainly never met the people who fled and rebuilt there anyway. Run all 4 sites together, and a pattern holds that has nothing to do with the Ice Age. A camp burned by its own people on the way out, a house rebuilt on the same footprint 5 times, a community erased by other humans and never reclaimed. A village buried by a volcano and resettled generations later by strangers. 23,000 years ago. 11,000. 10,000. 4,000. The destroyer changes every time. Fire, decay, violence, ash. The instinct underneath it, in every case but one, doesn't move at all, return to the place, or rebuild the shape of the life that stood there before. It's the same instinct behind a family rebuilding on the same lot after a wildfire, or a town putting itself back together on a floodplain it has already flooded on twice. Every one of those campsites is a hole in the ground now. Every single one of them was, at some point, someone's answer to starting over,